stand over there?
I think it's easy to stand.
Is it?
Some people can't sit down. You mind?
No, no problem at all.
Have you got a zapper?
I have a zapper. No, my network is marked. Right. I noticed the first mistake. I meant to swap that to OBI today. Actually, give this same talk to the Royal Commission.
No, second-hand talk.
The third hand one actually, because I gave it this morning at 8:30 at a breakfast meeting. Whoever came up with that idea, breakfast meeting, 8:30 on a Monday. Anyway, so I do apologise for that first error. This talk is based on a paper that myself and my colleague Alice Bowes wrote that was published in Binding Law Science and the Philosophical Transactions journal the latter part of last year, and I gave a similar, slightly longer talk than this at the Exeter Climate Change Conference that there was in the autumn, I think it was last year. And it's just trying to look at climate change again, looking at the latest emission trends and the latest science, and bringing those two together. And when I say the latest science, I'm talking here still about very consensual science, the IPCC process, which in itself is incredibly consensual. So it does not really accurately represent, I would say, what is the mean opinion, if there's such a thing, in science. It's probably well below the mean opinion, because it's filtered through basically lawyers and economists. So, but this is based on that quite conservative, consensual view anyway, and it's still a quite worrying message. And also, the paper was written, and this talk was put together before the bankers decided to become climate saviours and bring our economy collapsing down around our ears, which actually is probably the best thing that's going to happen in terms of our CO2 emissions. I think it'll probably be a brief interlude before they shoot back up again. But it's interesting that when we look at the data, and I'm pretty certain it'll be the case, that we'll actually see emissions dropping. And that's principally because CO2 and consumption are intricately linked. Despite all that we hear, that we're decarbonising systems, we have never decarbonised systems. There's no historical precedent for this. All we do is we pass it on to another country to produce the goods for us. So in fact, in the UK, our carbon intensity has probably gone up of consumption, because the Chinese, who are making a lot of our goods for us now, have a higher carbon intensity for their energy production than we do. That's not to say they should be making our goods, but that we should not therefore think ourselves as successful in reducing our GDP carbon intensity, because it's really just gone elsewhere. Right, I'm going to say a little bit first about dangerous climate change, and there's been one slide on that. Then say something about cumulative emissions, and I think this completely rewrites the chronology of climate change. It's nothing new, we've known about this for a long time, but we haven't linked the chronology to that, we've linked it to something else altogether. So quite a mythical view of climate change here. Misplaced optimism, ignoring the bean counters. These are people that add up the CO2 molecules, the train spotters of the climate change world, and they are very important people, and we ignore them at our peril, and we have done for some considerable time. And then say something about greenhouse gas emission pathways, and my conclusion will be that whichever way we go, it's impossible. So what we have to do is resolve the impossible. But that's kind of the challenge. There is no route out there that people say, well, we can possibly get there. So every route out there, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, will be impossible. We have to try. So climate change, right, dangerous climate change. I mean, it's a very subjective view. This is the view the UK and the EU continually recommit to every March, the European Council, and that they say this. I hope this is a number most of you are familiar with. If any of you are not familiar with any of this, or I'm going to slow, let me speed up. I don't know what it is you already know, but this 2 degrees C, the UK and the EU say, well, that's the sort of threshold between acceptable climate change and dangerous climate change. And we think we can get away with that sort of temperature rise. And that temperature rise is compared with pre-industrial periods, and it's brought about by principally anthropogenic human emissions of greenhouse gases. So we think we can cope with about 2 degrees C, and we've seen obviously, well, the science is a bit mixed up, but probably 0.7, 0.8 degrees, something like that so far. But bear in mind, we say that's what our threshold is, apparently. But for many people in the world, that is already extremely dangerous, if not deadly. So people will die at 2 degrees C, and that in some parts of the world may have some temporary benefit from it. But broadly, there are a lot of people who will die at 2 degrees C. So it may be okay for the rich Westerners to fight their way out of the system briefly, but it is not avoiding dangerous climate change. So I think we should, even though I'm going to say that this is very unlikely we'll achieve this, I still think we should bear in mind that that is probably well and truly entering the realm of dangerous climate change. If you look at Darfur, some of the issues around Darfur that look like they're being exacerbated by climate are caused by climate change, exacerbated by climate change. So climate change is already killing people in places like that by increasing some of the tensions there on water changes. Let's have a look at the emission reduction targets. I've already heard one of these today. I won't say from whom. I've actually heard a lot of these this morning. People talk about these, when we talk about climate change emissions, they all talk about these sort of percentage reductions by something over here, which is broadly not in my term of office. So 80% by a long way away from me, so I won't bother. That's what each of those broadly says. And that, I think, is a real worry, that we've had that approach for a long time. The scientists have sat back knowing that it's incorrect and have merely supported it, either actively or tacitly. So I think it's about time we said that this has nothing to do with climate change, I'll say in a minute. CO2 is in the atmosphere for 100 plus years, probably well over 100 years now actually. We've already managed to change some of the sinks. So CO2 is likely to be there when we emit it from the lights in here, from projection and so forth, from me travelling down here. That CO2 will be there for the next 100 to 200 years and it'll be added to by whatever I do and you do tomorrow. So this is quite worrying. It's the cumulative impact day in, day out. It's not about 2050, it's about what we're doing today.
So comfortable there,
No, I'm fine here. As long as I feel comfortable. I may not feel comfortable, but I feel comfortable. So, put bluntly, I would go a little bit further, and I would actually say that that percentage reductions have absolutely nothing to do with climate change. If anything, they probably misdirect us in terms of solutions and responses. So, what matters are these cumulative emissions. That's the bit. That's the take-home message here. It's cumulative emissions that matter. And if you think of it in terms of cumulative emissions, it completely rewrites the chronology away from these long-term gradual targets and much more towards urgent and radical reductions, which this is not in our term of office, and this is in our term of office. And that's not just for the politicians, that's for us, it's the public as well. That's all right. So this is a big shift. If you move to cumulative emissions, it very significantly changes the way that you have to look at the problem. And I would argue this is scientifically credible, and the old long-term routes and percentage reductions was not a scientifically credible approach. So to try and understand this, we developed a series of scenarios based principally on IPCC type data. So really still quite conservative scenarios, where we took the latest empirical data, this is pre the bankers, from all the various sources that would be reasonable for use and other ones as well, and the modelling data again from IPCC here, so from the processes that we all think are appropriate internationally, Hadley Centre, Stern Report, and so forth. Just wait for it. Some seats down here. So we've tried to understand this problem by looking at some emission scenarios based on pretty much the standard orthodox data. And what we've done is to start off with, firstly we included very optimistic forestry emissions. So we're not trying to be negative, we're trying to say, let's be really optimistic, let's imagine there's a real international agenda that goes beyond the rhetoric and trying to bring about some real change in climate change. So let's imagine something really optimistic about forestry emissions, and just to sort of put that in some sort of perspective. In this audience, probably much better than me. Forestry emissions are hugely uncertain, or deforestation emissions at the moment, hugely uncertain by a huge factor. I mean, they're one of the numbers that's commonly banded around is half the other number that's commonly banded around. So that level of uncertainty, a huge discrepancy. Somewhere between 12 and 25% of global greenhouse gases are from principally from deforestation. So we said, well, let's be optimistic. We took the best scenario from the literature in saying how fast we could curtail deforestation, and we went beyond that and said, let's have one more that's even more optimistic than that. So they're the scenarios for years out 2000, 2100. These are the emissions in CO2 here from forestry. That's the best one from the literature, from Houghton and others. And what matters here, the cumulative emissions, just to let you know, again, it's probably what you know, but it's the area under the curve that matters. Forget your long-term targets. It's the areas under the curve. Now that's the best one out there. So all of that there is shoved into the climate, into the atmosphere for us to deal with climate change perspective-wise, and that's the one that we've said as well. And this one here is 70% of the existing carbon stock locked up in the trees remains locked up at the end of the century, and this one is 80% remains locked up. So these are still quite high levels of deforestation, and actually those emissions are going up a little bit at the moment. So that's the deforestation being very optimistic. Now the other one is about non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, and principally just read that as food. It's not only food, but it's very significantly food emissions. And there we chose, again, to be quite optimistic about that, and I'll come to that in a minute. We assume that food emissions per capita were halved by 2050. Now that's that bit. Any climate graph you sort of see, you'll see something that does, it'll do something like this generally. And the bit out here is the bit from food. So this is food emissions, about 7.5 gigatons.
What is the food emission?
Food emissions, that's from things like animals, from rice paddy fields, from the whole agricultural process of producing food. There's a lot of methane in particular that comes from that process.
But not carbon from food, for some reason.
Not directly carbon, no. When you do get carbon as well, particularly if you're using things like ammonia. To make ammonia for making fertiliser, at the moment you principally use natural gas. But we're doing some work at the moment trying to see whether we can switch that.
Diesel for tractors.
Diesel for tractors, that side of thing. Well, they're important. I mean, there's certainly a factor.
This is methane.
This is principally methane emissions, yeah, the non-CO2 emissions. The other from the tractors will be in the energy sector. Okay, so this is principally from food. Now we've assumed that it halves by 2050, but that's nothing. I mean, we're not in that direction at all at the moment. Emissions are just rocketing per capita from food because we're eating more and more meat. So there are some real issues in there. And we took the EPA estimates of how that's going, and then we said, well, let's bring that right down very rapidly by 2050, and then take on after that. Now, just bear in mind, when you see global scenarios often painted, have a look at the bit of the tail. And you can, if you play with the maths a little bit, you can tell you something about what they think the population is. I was started looking at some of these recently, and because they do, a lot of the modelers are quite sort of algorithm and equation based, they don't really think about, well, it's people eating food, which is, you need to make it more contextual. So I looked at some of the models recently, and actually the tails were so small, they must have assumed a very high level of euthanasia, because the population obviously plummeted as they took on into the future. And this has really very significant implications, because this is all area under the curve. That's area under the curve you cannot get rid of, not unless you get rid of the population.
Does this include the demographic futures?
This is 9 billion. No, well, that halving is 9 billion. So there's a 9 billion assumption in here, which I'd say is much of the conservative type assumptions that we could, or the consensual assumptions. So there's 9 billion population in here, and with 9 billion you have to halve it to get it to 7.5 gigatons. So very optimistic on forestry, very optimistic on land use, and then you take the peak dates. When do we think emissions are globally going to peak? Obviously, again, the bankers have done a bit of a job for us, because it was obviously before that one briefly, but assuming it goes back up again. 2025 is what Bush said the States would peak in 2025, and that's quite worrying. If the States peaks in 2025, that means China and India are likely to be after that. Most of the non-OECD countries will be after the States, it would be reasonable to surmise. Stern chose 2015, a lot of people look at Stern report and forget that he had to choose that emissions globally would peak by 2015, otherwise his analysis would say things that were politically unacceptable. So his analysis peaks in 2015. The Climate Change Committee report peaks in, I think, 2016. So people think it was incredibly optimistic assumptions about when we're going to peak emissions, because otherwise you get very worrying answers. And we looked also at 2020. So let's factor into this the emissions data now, the bean counters. What do the emissions people tell us about? That's the sort of science bit behind it. What do the emissions people tell us? Well, firstly, it's getting worse. And I think it's quite worrying. That's the growth rate in CO2 now, CO2 here, for the last 100 years. So this is us, Rio 1992, somewhere in here, started rounding on about climate change, not in 2000, a lot more work, a lot more discussion about climate change since. So we're clearly very worried about climate change, we're spending a lot of time talking about it, having meetings like this. So obviously our emission rates must have gone down, but they've gone up. So despite all the rhetoric on climate change, our emissions are going up. I don't know if there's a one-to-one correlation there, with the vision to stop talking about climate change. But it's quite worrying to me that we're actually going completely different direction. We can see the iceberg out there, and we've rung down to the engine room and said to the chief engineer in the Titanic, put your foot to the floor and head towards the iceberg. That's what we're doing, knowingly doing that. We're consciously doing that now. So that's the CO2 trends. If we look at the CO2e trends, that's worse than we thought. What are we doing about it? Well, we're denying it. That's the growth rate in CO2. Sorry, exciting number next one. That's the growth rate in CO2e, now 2.8%, slightly lower than the CO2. Now, Stern's report was published in 2006. He did have access to the data if he wanted to look at it, and he had lots of money. So there's no excuse for the fact that he came out with 0.96%. He had the growth rate for the period he had data for that was not far off, 2% below the real data. Now, so we're actually denying what's happening. That's a huge difference. So 2% is, every year, that means you're out significant margins. So once your curve's doing this, the real curve's doing this. And it's the area under the curve that matters. Sorry. For those you don't know, CO2 is that's all of the greenhouse gases, all the principal basket of 6 greenhouse gases, includes your methane, your various synthetics, your fluorocarbons, sulfhexafluoride, and HFCs and so forth. So that includes all of the main greenhouse gases. So he had that out by a very significant margin. Again, he peaked in 2015, but that made his message just about acceptable, but It's not acceptable to me because the data was wrong. And I actually like a lot of the Stony report because I like the idea of a zero discount
But
rate.
sorry, if Stern assumed 1% instead of 2.8%, how did he get away with it?
Because the scientists never bother checking the data. No one ever talks to the bean counters. No one ever talks to the people that collect the numbers. They're wearing anoraks, clocking the numbers of trains as they come in. Who talks to them? No one talks to those sort of people. The scientists are doing sexy science work. It's very interesting, it's very exciting, very ivory tower. And unless you talk to people that count the numbers, count the carbon dioxide molecules, you only get one part of the story. And that's a real worry that we've done this historically. So all he did was he extrapolated. And it's not only Stern that's done this. Look at the climate change bill. There's more data that went into that as well. So you see this over and over again. People are not prepared to engage with the data that occurred. And principally what they do is they extrapolate 1990s data. Well, since 1990, things have got a lot worse. So they extrapolated the nice bit and not bothered with what happened since. And all this data is available. The government feeds its data into this, into CDAC and created all of this. So this is, I think this has really been very misleading. And one thing we put, I hope in misplaced optimism more than one place to put it. This is the SRES scenarios. These are a set of emission scenarios that were revisited in 2000, so quite recently. And these are sort of what might happen to emissions out to the future. And quite a few people said, well, these look a bit extreme, we're not going to be there, are we? It's only 2010. Then we've bumbled along at the high end of that. If you plot the latest data on that, you're above it. So we're far worse than we thought we were, far worse than we have been historically. We're pretending it's not happening. And the worst that we thought we could imagine, we're way above that. So that's a pretty damning message to start off with. So that's this sort of the emissions backdrop to add to the science stuff before that cumulative emissions. So when you add all of this together, at the failure, out of the abject failure to reduce emissions, the latest science on cumulative emissions, and what they all say about 2 degrees C. Well, this is really getting to the sort of fuzzy end of science, really. The science is never black and white, about what the journalists try and tell us. 2 degrees C, so 50-50 chance of 2 degrees C, or thereabouts. That's the sort of concentration of CO2 you want in the atmosphere. That's, for those, that's 450 parts. E, yeah. But that's for 50, that's the middle of the BU, that's the middle of the Meinshausen curves. So that's where that number comes from. And anyway, so that gives you roughly a 50-50 chance. It's a very conventional way of looking at this, but if you look at the data that's out there, that's roughly the middle of the set of curves that are out there, that sort of concentration for CO2e.
And without the E, it would be about 400?
I always think 50 ppmv is not unreasonable, but I see some people say near 80 you should take off. I mean, pretty much we're there.
370, we're past it.
Yeah, we're pretty much at it. I mean, in many respects. The aerosols are helping us because they sort of add a temporary cooling. So that's roughly what you need to aim for. Now, if you start, what we can say from that, well, there's a lot of numbers here, but you don't need to worry too much about it, it's just the idea behind it. That's 2 degrees C, you can imagine roughly. AR4 means lots of fancy scientists in the IPCC, so that's the latest IPCC process in their report, so that's the latest conventional stuff. Well, there's the dates. And that's the amount of CO2, that's billion tons of CO2e that you can emit. That's how much you can dump in the atmosphere, somewhere between that, between 2000 and 2100, for that concentration we had before, which is a 50-50 chance of 3C. So it's quite a big range. That's because the models are very, very uncertain. There's a lot of differences in the models. But even so, with that range, you can still say something really very useful. And the policy, though, even the size is uncertain, the policy message is really crystal clear, has been for a long time. So let's start to plot some of that. We know now the cumulative emissions. We know roughly what's happening in terms of CO2 emissions going up. We know roughly when, well, we can choose 3 peak dates. So we can plot those now. That's the data, that's the emissions going up. There's a peak in 2015, a sort of Stern type peak. There's a 2020 peak, and there's a 2025. Remember, it's the area under the curve that matters. So those numbers I showed you before, that's the amount of stuff you can dump in the atmosphere, that's the bit underneath the curve. So obviously the further out you go, the further into the future you go, going up, the less you've got after that. So you'll see that they get steeper and steeper. But they're all basically lemmings off a cliff. They're all virtually impossible in any reasonable sense. The other thing you'll notice is that quite a few of the lines start to disappear, you get fewer lines. And that's simply because you can't physically achieve it with the lower end of those models. As I said before, you've got quite a range in the science. So as you go further into the future, there simply isn't enough emission capacity out there in the atmosphere to absorb it. So you have to rely on the sort of optimistic end of the science being right, not the pessimistic end of the science.
So to keep interrupting, these are all designed to limit.
These are all designed for 2 degrees C. Right. Now, if we take the middle one, which is 2020 peak, assuming we peak emissions globally in 2020, just to give you some sort of sense what that might mean, that's about 10% per annum reduction. Obviously, that one's a bit more than 10%, but yeah, the lucky end of things is 2020. Then you're talking about 10% per annum reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if you take on that, if you then took off that, the optimistic view of deforestation, if you then took off this, the emissions that are embedded in that, and the emissions for food, which is what all this bit is into the future, that means for energy it'd be much, much higher than that. If you then assume that the OECD countries are going to peak before the non-OECD countries, which seems morally a reasonable position to take, then that would be much, much higher for the OECD countries. And then this is per year, every single year. So you might argue that that looks, well, impossible. There are plenty of economists here, so they usually start phoning them out at 10% to annum. They usually like 1% to annum. How do you deal with 10? Now let's have, let's just show it for energy. And I believe the film show next will benefit. Firstly, if you do it for energy only, take out the forestry and so forth, 13 of the 18 scenarios is actually impossible. So already, most of the science saying you can't do it. You can't decarbonise fast enough. But if you take the more optimistic end, you'd have to completely decarbonise the global energy system by 2035, 2045. That's what you have that's the shape of the curves there. So, right, if we can't do that, what can we do? Well, let's say we go to higher temperatures. Now, to get up to higher temperatures, this is a 50-50 chance of 3 or 4 degrees C, but really bear in mind now, this is based on IPCC science. And in that, a lot of the feedback work that some people in this room have been working on is not factored in. They know it's not factored in, it's probably not factored in, I think not reasonably, because it's not sufficiently quantitatively robust to put in the models a lot of the time and in the analysis. But we know that they're occurring, we have some handle on the numbers now, and we know that most of them, certain people even disagree with me if they're much better than me about this, they're likely to make it worse, possibly considerably worse. So they're not factored in here. I'm assuming that we're really lucky and that God's on our side, and we don't have all these feedbacks, they're not going to happen. So this is a fairly optimistic view, because at these sort of temperatures you would expect to see very significant feedbacks. So let's go for these sort of higher concentrations. Now, I won't go through all analysis, just something really simple here. At 3 degrees C, you'd need a 9% reduction in CO2 emissions from energy by 2020. Repeat to 9%. 4 degrees C, now 4 degrees C is pretty much full melting of Greenland, which you can stop once you get towards these sort of temperatures. That's 7 meters of sea level rise. That's going to take, again, hard to say exactly, but something like 300 years. But by the end of the century, you'd see a significant chunk of that already affecting the oceans. You'd have Antarctica and a lot of other impacts of that. You'd lose the Amazon almost completely at those sort of temperatures. So many of the ecosystems that we know, which simply, well, I think probably all the ecosystems we know would be radically changed if not disappear altogether. And lots of social systems simply will not cope with those sort of changes. But we can probably cope with that. So that adaptation is virtually impossible, but that is just about livable with in terms of mitigation. So that's what I'm saying, it's all about possible futures. But let's provide a bit of context to these percentage reductions. What do we have? Well, we'll go back to our friend Stern. Stern points out that anything greater than 1% per annum reduction has only ever been associated with economic recession or upheaval. That's not a particularly wonderful message, unless you like economic recession or upheaval. If we look at the UK, we had the dash for gas here, so that was a big shift, very rapid indeed, towards a low carbon future, for one of those reasons, Maggie and Arthur can get on. But we had a big shift from coal to gas in the UK, and a massive increase in nuclear occurred within about 20 years. So a huge change in the French nuclear system, which is a very low carbon fuel, not zero by any means, but much lower than coal or gas. And that was allied with about 1% per annum reduction in their emissions. And they didn't factor in aviation shipping. So broadly, the best example we have of a sort of planned approach towards in this case, deliberately planned for low carbon, but towards a low carbon future, had virtually zero emission reduction. And we're looking at 3.5% or 9% or higher. But we have an example, fortunately, out there, the collapse of the Soviet economy. Now, if we can manage to do that, that's probably considerably greater than that for the OECD countries, then that would help us move towards 4 degrees C. 4 degrees C. That's the scale of the problem. The collapse, the amount of emissions saving or reduction rates in Russia, as the economy collapsed, we would have to achieve more than that. And we'd probably have to start looking at achieving that in the next 3, 5, 7 years, something like that, well before 2020 date, to allow other countries to have their emissions going up.
Every year.
Every single year in, year out.
And are they global percentage?
Well, we'd have to, globally, as I said before, we need 3.5% from energy. Right, but it becomes quite tricky because that roughly works out initially about 6% at least for the OECD countries. The problem is that the non-OECD and the OECD countries are about 50-50 split for emissions at the moment. If you think about the non-OECD, if their emissions go up every year, every time they go up by a little bit, and ours is going down, next year the percentages ours got put down by is a bigger and bigger bit, because theirs are going up from a larger number and ours are going down from a smaller number. So very rapidly that percentage just goes almost out of control, and you virtually get, you've got to decarbonise by sort of next Wednesday. And this is looking at 4 degrees C, this is not looking at 2. So these are really, really disturbing numbers. That it's a completely different world that we're entering. So I think we have to rearrange these drivers for climate change. And away from 2 degrees C, we've been saying this for a while, but we were told we couldn't say it politically. And the person who told us we couldn't say it politically said it to the Guardian, so we were quite annoyed about that. We were told a few years ago we shouldn't say this. But we were saying that we should mitigate for 2, we should go all out to reduce our emissions in line with the 2 degrees C target. I'd like to see it being lower than that, to be honest. But I don't think it's simply, in my view, completely irresponsible to adapt for 2 degrees C, because it looks like we're going to fail. So I think, given, and this is important for the OECD countries that, we've should reap what we've sown to some extent. I don't care too much about the OECD. It's the non-OECD countries that have not caused this problem, but they need to be adapting to something far, far higher, whatever their regional equivalent is to 4 degrees C. So I think we need to think of a completely different driver for adaptation. So really, what I'm saying is that if economic growth is not possible with 6% carbon reduction, looking at the evidence that it is, then I was recently told to change the word recession to contraction, because that was more politically acceptable. So that word there I think really means recession, but anyway. Does it look more, does contraction sound better to you than recession? I'd love to be convinced, but collapse, but that's even less of it. So I think you have to make a shift towards something that was a planned economic contraction at a global level. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the non-OECD countries couldn't have their economies growing. I mean, hopefully they'll use a better measure than GDP. But their economies could go up, but it would depend on ours coming down in terms of consumption and emissions. In the very long run, it won't matter because we can probably decarbonise the energy system, but we have to do this so quickly. We can't decarbonise the energy system in time. This is this about urgency. We cannot get nuclear power stations, wind turbines, carbon capture and storage, microgrids. These things are going to take years to put in place. The mirrors in the Sahara and supergrids, all these sort of wonderful ideas, they'll take decades to really significantly penetrate, by which is simply too late. So we have no choice but to get energy demand down very rapidly, and that basically means reduce our consumption.
So where does the money come from if there's no economic growth?
Money for what?
For your solar installations and your...
Don't answer that question until we get to the discussion period. Clarification.
We're getting to the bankers to find more houses. So I would argue here then that the focus on win-win opportunities, which I hear all the time, far too much naive optimism. I like optimism if it's got a bit of reality behind it, but complete naive optimism. In the solar panels in the Sahara, I heard recently talked by someone who should remain nameless, but recently wrote a very famous economic report that I referred to here. Saying he thought this was a really good option, and that was a super good, and feeding into Europe. I thought, well, firstly, Africa might want some of the energy from the Sahara. Why would they necessarily want to flog it all to Europe? I mean, how long would it take to put in place? I mean, probably 20 years. I mean, we had a Manhattan project, and really spent all the time effort doing it for 10 to 20 years. It's simply too late. We need it in the medium to long run, but we cannot rely on it. So far too much nonsensical rubbish talks about win-win opportunities. And I'm a mechanical engineer. I like these sort of technologies. They're jobs for me. I like playing on big bits of shiny kit. But they're not going to save the day, unfortunately. And there's going to be a lot of pain, and there are going to be many losers. And this is really a huge issue. What can you do about this? How do you distribute pain to the losers? So I mean, this is probably something that you're all far more familiar asking these sort of questions. I hope the answer to some of these questions than I am. But it seems to me that we're going to have pain, and it doesn't seem fair that only poor people have nothing to do with it, and geographically not predisposed to handle it, are going to suffer. 4 degrees C, and this is really important, is not business as usual. That's every orthodox reduction stock pulled out as far as we could possibly imagine. So that's everything we think we can do. Besides, we've got to think about things that we don't know. It's a bit like Rothschild's unknown unknowns. I think the adaptation agenda needs completely rewriting. So we've got UK, we're here from UK SIP. We've got UK SIP coming out this year, which is the adaptation sort of agenda really. And it'd be interesting. It's been an interesting heuristic. We've learned a lot from doing it, but I think we probably need to start from scratch again. Because it's based on far too optimistic views of the future. Both mitigation and adaptation rates are far beyond what we're prepared to calculate. So we're not prepared to accept what the data is telling us, and we've known this data for a long time. There is no historical precedent of dealing with this sort of rate of change, other than meteorite attacks and not attacks, meteorite incidents. But there's nothing that we've seen in our history that allows us to prepare for this or gives us any lessons on how to deal with it. And it's completely new and uncharted territory. So we just don't know how to deal with it. And I think if we recognise that and we start to think about it, if we pretend it's something different, then we're not going to come up with any reasonable responses. So I'll finish off with Mr. Unger. If I have a meeting, owe a lot of money, because I just quote almost every time I'm saying that at every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. And we have no option. The future has to be different. The future has to be impossible. We're about to achieve that pressing note. Perhaps uplifting note.
Thank you very much. That is extremely scary.